J.L. Austin, John Langshaw, Austin. And my favorite philosophy book of the 20th century, Sense and Sensibilia by J.L. Austin. Notice that, it's he's playing around with Jane Austen's novel Sense and Sensibility. A typical foray of wit by the mighty witty J.L. Austin. That's one reason this is my favorite philosophy book of the 20th century. Have I really thought about that carefully? It's just written with great charm and wit. And also very pointedly, though. He's attacking people. He's attacking people he knows. Even maybe people that were in the room on some of these occasions when he delivered these lectures. But man, he's doing it in a very delightful way. Austin was spent his career as a professor at Oxford, as opposed to Cambridge, where Wittgenstein and Russell and others were, or maybe not by that time. Not Russell anyway. Maybe. Okay. And he lived a fairly interesting life. For one thing, he was an intelligence officer in World War II, and I think there's some dispute about this. Maybe some of the stuff is secret or whatever. I think he was a code breaker, basically, and one of the key code breakers, along with Alan Turing and others. And that's, in a way, not surprising, because one thing he displays is an amazing sensitivity to the meaning of words. To, if I was hiring someone to think about, to get me started by thinking about what the kind of thing the Germans might be communicating, it would be J.L. Austin. And, okay, so he's, in a way, he's not an empirical linguist. Maybe his research is mostly in some ways about himself, like he, as a competent speaker of the English language. At any rate, another reason I'm doing this is because it is a great manifesto for what's known as ordinary language philosophy, which has already come up with regard to Wittgenstein. Okay. Now, the other thing, and maybe the thing that you would most often get in a philosophy of language course on Austin, is speech act theory. This rests on some really deep insights, actually, and was explored for decades afterwards. After Austin's work, he died pretty young. Probably shouldn't have been chain smoking. But anyway, speech act theory. And I guess the classic statement of speech act theory is Austin's book, How to Do Things with Words. It's a great classic, actually. But it's maybe not as enjoyable to read. I guess another reason I'm doing this is because it might engage the history of philosophy type courses that you've had. Like if you've had 17th and 18th century philosophy, this will show you in a way 20th century analytic philosophy of language grappling pretty frigging directly with the same issues that Hume and Descartes and Locke were grappling with, about the nature of human perception above all. But Austin goes through language to do this. Because how to do things with words is a bit of a slog, for one thing. But okay, so one thing is, like, we've seen, like, the basic question, I think the basic question I posed as at the beginning of the semester is, how are words related to the world? How does language give us access to reality? What's the relation, for example, in Kripke, of a name to what it names? Or in Frege, okay? Well, one thing Austin points out, and again, this has something to do with his sensitivity to the ways we ordinarily do use language, is that you know certain assertions might be fairly naturally read that way. Like, okay, here's like in a Wittgenstein Tractatus way, for one thing. Like, here's the sentence, and here's the fact. Okay, do they match up or not? True or false? But one thing Austin points out is that a lot of our sentences, and maybe many of our sentences have at least an element of this, are not primarily, should not primarily be thought of as making true or false assertions. It's not surprising that logicians have focused obsessively on sentences like that because they're trying to work out what assertions follow from what assertions, what the inferential relations are between sentences with truth value, true or false. Right? But now, consider a sentence like, I promise to meet you at 10. Or I promise to grade your papers by Friday. All right? Does that describe an antecedent fact? Like if we were trying to do a tractatus on that, what would be the fact that that sentence maps or pictures? I promise to grade by Friday. That's not describing an antecedent state of affairs. It is performing an action by speaking words. That is itself, saying that is itself making the promise. That's sufficient to make the promise, and that's a speech act. I mean, and there's many examples of this. I'm not going to run this whole thing because we're not really covering this theme. Great theme in philosophy of language, though. Sorry. I now pronounce you man and wife. True or false? Just the wrong dimension. Okay. I mean, there are other kinds of sentences that do not have truth value, like questions or imperatives. But those, I now pronounce you man and wife, actually has a subject predicate form. It appears to be an assertion in some way. So, I mean, one thing he's just saying is like the uses of language are much wider than description. Okay. So, when we speak, we're not mini scientists or whatever. We're doing all kinds of cultural stuff by speaking. And, one thing that's indicating is that philosophy of language, as we've seen it more or less, at least until Wittgenstein, has very impoverished data. It's looking only at a very small kind of subset of the ways we use language. And, okay, so that expands the field immediately in amazingly interesting ways. And then what are the limits of, say, a performative utterance? In what cases am I making assertion, and in what cases am I, performing an action primarily? I mean, you might think of a lot of what politicians say, even when they are apparently assertions. Right? They're produced to have some kind of cognitive effect on you rather than to say something true in general, I think. Right? That's sort of the nature of political discourse. It's performative in that sense, right? Instead of assertoric. All right, now let's talk about sense and sensibility. I'm going to use a printout of our PDF that has much of the book in it. So now what he's going to do, he's going to talk about what he calls sense data theory. This is the idea, for example, that when I look and see, look at this lamp right here, I'm not directly seeing the lamp. I'm having an impression, for example. That's the way Hume puts it. In a way, what I'm experiencing is my own sense impression of the lamp. You can see this because, or supposedly you can see this because, like, for example, as I move around the lamp, my impression changes. Okay, my experience changes. I'm from stuff like that. experiences as I move around the lamp, etc. Okay, experiences of leaving the room and coming back in and stuff. I'm kind of cobbling together a concept of this lamp, or inferring that there is an enduring object out there from a series of momentary impressions. Now, sense data theory in that sense, and another term for sense data here is sensibilia. That's a plural. I guess the singular would be sensibilium. I never really heard anyone use that one, but it'd be cute to do that. I'm having a sensibilium. I don't know, is that the right... anyway, whatever. The centrality of that conceptuality to modern philosophy, almost right up until Austin Wright's, really, is just extreme. Okay, so what's the bottom line for Descartes is that we experience our own ideas. We can only experience our own ideas. That's all we have access to. For one thing, we might be dreaming, okay? So the ideas might not correspond to any kind of reality. All we have is the train of ideas. The idea that I might be dreaming right now, for example, indicates that I'm having a stream of ideas rather than some kind of direct apprehension of an external reality. Because it could all seem exactly the same and the external reality be deleted. Okay, I don't even know how to describe this, but, Kant thinks that we experience the world in our own representations, as our own representations. It's much more complex than Humean impressions, maybe. Much more complex. Schopenhauer says there's only one thing we can know for sure, and that is that we only experience our own representations. It's just, A.J. Ayer, right? Like, all we've got is these sense data. If you can't bring your assertion back to a set of sense data, immediate phenomenal contents of consciousness, then your words don't mean anything at all. And A.J. Ayer, not what we read from Language, Truth, and Logic, but his work, Foundations of Empirical Knowledge, is the whipping boy of J.L. Austin. But he's whipping the whole frigging modern philosophy tradition, especially in the British Isles, but elsewhere too. Okay? And he does it by analyzing the ordinary meanings of the words that are used to try to create this picture that in a way, like we're experiencing the world on a screen. And then the question is, do the images on that screen, our consciousness or whatever, our sensorium, match up to some kind of external physical reality? And it's no wonder if you start with that question where you go like, well, let's just lop off the external reality. What the fuck? All right? And that gives you Berkeley or whatever. And then all you've got is a string of impressions. At least that solves one problem, which is how in the world do you know that these alleged impression, mental images you're having, match up to an external reality? You just say, well, that question doesn't arise, because there's no actual reason to stipulate an external or material reality. All right, now J.L. Austin, I think, if any philosopher has ever destroyed any theory in philosophy, J.L. Austin completely whacks sense data theory, and hence much of modern philosophy. I think so. And one of the pretty amazing things about this book is how thin it is. He does it quick. It's based on reconstructed lecture notes, and I did actually include the preface where the editor, G.J. Warnock, talks about how they assembled this book. Now, as I do this, I probably do a little more reading from the manuscript because I do love from the book because I do love the prose. Okay, so the general doctrine goes like this, that we're going to be attacking. This is on page 2 of our printout. We never see or otherwise perceive or sense, or anyhow we never directly perceive or sense material objects or material things, but only sense data, our own ideas, impressions, sense perceptions, percepts, etc. There's lots of words for these. And I guess a lot of these modern philosophers and modern style philosophers think a lot turns on which term you use. Okay, but they all basically mean this kind of train of mental imagery. He's going to kill Husserlian phenomenology, among many other things, I think, with this. One might well want to ask how seriously this doctrine is intended, that I never directly see anything in the world. Just how strictly and literally the philosophers who propound it mean their words to be taken. But I think we had better not worry about this question for the present. It is, as a matter of fact, not at all easy to answer. For, strange though the doctrine looks, that we only see our own ideas or something, what we've all believed, it's just what we've all believed all along. You know, so says Hume, okay? So says Ayer. He's just reconstructing our ordinary talk, actually. We all, you know, if we were philosophers, we'd realize that this is what we're experiencing. We'd all agree to that. Like, once it's set out, it's obvious, kind of. He's going like, really? Because this is a bizarre doctrine, I'm sorry. It's friggin' surreal. And it's also kind of disgusting, actually, in my opinion. Like, it just drops this curtain between you and the world, you know, which, in my view, does not exist. And if it did, you know, we'd be duty bound to tear it down to find the truth. Okay. Take it easy. It's not really that bad, this wacky sounding doctrine that we only perceive our own imagery. I mean, this is kind of question begging. He's describing it as a bizarre doctrine, just kind of, which is a nice little rhetorical move because it's supposed to be a common sense doctrine, according to Berkeley and Hume. Yeah. Really, it's just what we've all believed all along. Here's a great line. There's the bit where you say it and the bit where you take it back. And if you bring that, which I have been for decades now, to various philosophical texts, you'll see that is often the case. There's the bit where I say the radical weird thing. I do this myself. The bit where I say the radical weird thing. And then the bit where I say, oh, you know what? This is all just, you know, really, I know it doesn't seem this way, but it's kind of common sense. You know, it's not so bad. You can go on basically believing what you believed before. Don't worry about it. Okay? And a lot of philosophy has that form, a kind of there and back again journey, a la The Hobbit. All right. Now, so here's his view. What's gone wrong has gone wrong in the language. In a way, this is connected to Wittgenstein in the Tractatus too, and the positivists. He's going to make this problem dissolve, go away, by analysis of the language, but it's a very different kind of analysis of the language than the Tractatus or Phrygian style moves. It's much more like the later Wittgenstein. Just as an aside, I don't know what the influence of later Wittgenstein or mid-period Wittgenstein is on J.L. Austin. I'm sure he's aware of what's going on in some sense, okay? I do think they're kind of on parallel tracks. One thing I would say is that they both go in this kind of ordinary language meaning its use way, and that there's a lot of that implicit in the work of the philosopher G.E. Moore, who we haven't really talked about, very close to Russell. I'm sure I've mentioned him, one of my favorite philosophers. So I think that maybe, and I think that in G.E. Moore, early in the 20th century, you find declarations of kind of ordinary language philosophy, and you find ordinary language analysis, for example, in his proof of the existence of the external world. But so that's my story. I think maybe they come up, Wittgenstein and Austin kind of come up with similar approaches independently, but maybe both under the influence of G.E. Moore too. Or maybe it's a more complicated bifurcated thing where they're kind of aware of each other's work, actually, Austin and Wittgenstein. Austin was considerably younger, though. Okay, so my general opinion about sense data theory is that it is a typically scholastic view, attributable first to an obsession with a few particular words, the uses of which are oversimplified, not really understood, or carefully studied, or correctly described, and second to an obsession with a few, and nearly always the same, half-studied facts. And that's a little declaration of what he's going to do with ordinary language philosophy. Like, he's diagnosing the problem as like, really, you just went wrong because you like deployed all these words carelessly and just threw them in right at the start. Like, where this went wrong was right at the start, where you started abusing words. And then you kind of fed them back after you reinterpreted them in some kind of strange philosophical sense. You went back and re-injected them into ordinary contexts and found out that we only experience our own sense data or whatever. So if we could cure your linguistic illness, philosophers, we could cure your crazy theory of perception. And this theory of perception persists in some form, although it's also questioned, I think, even in psychology. People just kind of presume that we are experiencing the world through a series of images or our own narratives or something like that. Although, extended mind thesis, look it up. It's more like what we got going on here. Okay. And here's a typical Austin passage. The question, do we perceive material things or sense data? No doubt looks very simple. It's a simple dilemma. It's got to be one or the other. Too simple, way too simple, but it's entirely misleading. Compare Thales', the pre-Socratic philosopher's similarly vast and oversimple question: what the world is made of. So yeah, some of these pre-Socratic philosophers say, well, what is the world made of? Just presupposing that it's got to be one thing. Like just begging the question sort of by the form of their words and leading themselves badly astray. One of the most important points to grasp is that these two terms, sense data and material things, live by taking in each other's washing. What is spurious is not one term of the pair, but the antithesis itself. You can't have one without the other. Let's get rid of them both because this is really a silly theory. There is no one kind of thing that we perceive, but many different kinds. So the answer, what's the one sort of thing we perceive? Material things or sense data? Well, that's just leading you down the garden path of the idea that there must be some one sort of thing that we perceive. All right. Why would you think that, really? Listen to what people say, because there is not one thing that they say, one sort of thing they say they perceive. There is no one kind of thing that we perceive, but many different kinds, the number being reducible, if at all, by scientific investigation and not by philosophy. If you want to know what we perceive, then go out and study it, If you want to know what you're perceiving when you perceive a star, go do a spectrographic analysis that tells you what the elements are up there, but don't, go like, oh, I'm seeing a sense data, or I'm seeing a material thing. I mean, who talks like that about seeing a star, Pens are in many ways, though not in all ways, unlike rainbows, these are things we perceive, which are in many ways, though not in all ways, unlike after images, which in turn are in many ways, but not in all ways, unlike the pictures on a cinema screen, and so on, without assignable limit. So we are not to look for an answer to the question, what kind of thing we perceive? What we have above all to do is negatively to rid ourselves of such illusions as the argument from illusion, and we will, and I think maybe I'll end up covering that in class or even in another video lecture. maybe I'll get to the beginning of it. Okay. It is the way we're going to address this is not by saying, oh no, we don't perceive material things, or yes, we only perceive material things, or whatever. It's a matter of unpicking one by one a mass of seductive, mainly verbal fallacies, of exposing a wide variety of concealed motives. And, so suspicious activity, an operation which leaves us, in a sense, just where we began, in the middle of ordinary language, just as Wittgenstein said. Leave the language alone, okay? And what I'm trying to do is show you where you already are, not take you someplace else. And to show you where you already are, I'm going to have to disassemble the philosophical mumbo jumbo that you've generated inside this actual environment or whatever. Okay, I mean, and in a sense, okay, but actually we may hope to learn something positive in the way of a technique for dissolving philosophical worries, some kinds of philosophical worry, not the whole of philosophy, and also something about the meanings of some English words like reality, seems, looks, etc., which besides being philosophically very slippery, are in their own right interesting, as used in ordinary language. Reality, seems, looks. Besides, there is nothing so plain boring as the constant repetition of assertions that are not true, and sometimes not even faintly sensible. If we can reduce this a bit, it will be all to the good. So one thing he's saying, like, A.J. Ayer, man, he spent his career just repeating assertions that are not even faintly sensible, okay? And same with Descartes and Hume, man. All right. Now, that's a pretty bold move. And he is an incredibly bold intellectual, even though he kind of has this little kind of almost tone of humility before the ordinary. Okay. Now, okay, yes, I will briefly start into the argument from illusion, which he just destroys. Okay, now one thing I should say is that the PDF is just a little messed up. In section 2, which begins on page 6, the second and third paragraphs are a quote from A.J. Ayer's Foundations of Empirical Knowledge. It's not indented here, and I couldn't manipulate the PDF to indent it or enclose it in quotes. So you need to know that it should be indented, and it's a quote from Ayer, because this is the position not the position he's taking up, but the position that he's going to destroy. And Lord, he does destroy. So here is the Ayer statement of the argument from illusion, and also the basic sense data theory position. Ayer. It does not normally occur to us that there is any need for us to justify our belief in the existence of material things. At the present moment, for example, I have no doubt whatsoever that I really am perceiving the familiar objects, the chairs and table, the pictures and books and flowers with which my room is furnished, and I am therefore satisfied that they exist. I recognize indeed that people are sometimes deceived by their senses, but this does not lead me to suspect that my own sense perceptions cannot in general be trusted, and even that they may be deceiving me now. Or even that they may be deceiving me now. I don't think that, just because sometimes I go wrong. And what these sense data theorists make of illusions and dreams, that's how they get to the sense data stuff, actually. But common sense is like, well, sometimes I undergo illusions, maybe. But, my perception is, common sense supposedly says this, is reliable about the external world. I believe that in practice, most people agree, this is Ayer writing, agree with John Locke. Most people agree with John Locke. That's a suspicious sentence right there. That the certainty of things existing in rerum natura, in the world, when we have the testimony of our senses for it, is not only as great as our frame can attain to, but as our condition needs. When, however, Ayer continuing, one turns to the writings of those philosophers who have recently concerned themselves with the subject of perception, one may begin to wonder whether this matter is quite so simple. Oh, yeah, my perception informs me truly. I have occasional mistakes, but, whatever. The common sense, the ordinary man's account of his own reliability, the reliability of his own experience. And boy, does does Austin ridicule this idea that Ayer is talking about the ordinary man who agrees with John Locke, okay, in his theory of perception, what the ordinary man would say. So if Ayer is going to put the argument on what the ordinary man would say, well, he's done come to the wrong place, because Austin will kick his butt on that. All right, he's got the ordinary man sounding like John Locke or Aristotle or whatever, does Ayer. Okay, it is true that they do, philosophers do, in general, allow that our belief in the existence of material things is well-founded. Very generous of them, really. Some of them, indeed, would say that there were occasions on which we knew for certain the truth of such propositions as this is a cigarette, or this is a pen. Some philosophers would even say that we could know with certainty that, this is a marker. Right. G.E. Moore said that for sure. Like, nothing could be more certain. So start with that. Okay? Anyway. But even so, they are not, these philosophers, for the most part, prepared to admit that such objects as pens or cigarettes are ever directly perceived. What, in their opinion, we directly perceived is always an object of a different kind from these, one which it is now customary to give the name of sense datum. Okay. So, philosophers, according to Ayer, are not prepared to admit with the ordinary man that they ever see a pen. Not directly. They perceive it indirectly. So now the sort of thing that Austin's going to say is, how do we use words like, if we ever talked about seeing something directly or seeing something indirectly, what do we mean? What are some examples of where we see something indirectly? For example, if we saw something through a periscope, it might be sensible to say that we saw it indirectly. If we saw it in a mirror image rather than in, what it's a mirror image of, maybe we saw it indirectly. But the idea that everything I see indirectly, it's nonsensical and certainly totally incompatible with the way the terms are used in ordinary language. Okay. I'll just give you a little bit of this. I really want to go through a whole bunch of these distinctions. I love this text so much. So maybe I'll just do another video lecture, or this could grow to a couple hours. But just to get what I was doing right there, this is on page 14. Philosophers, it is said, quote from Ayer, are not, for the most part, prepared to admit that such objects as pens or cigarettes are ever directly perceived. Now, of course, what brings us up short here is the word directly, a great favorite among philosophers, but actually one of the less conspicuous snakes in a linguistic grass. We have here, in fact, a typical case of a word which already has a very special use, being gradually stretched without caution or definition or any limit until it becomes first perhaps obscurely metaphorical, but ultimately meaningless. One can't abuse ordinary language without paying for it. and he continues in the note, especially if one abuses it without realizing what one is doing. Consider the trouble caused by unwitting stretching of the word sign, so as to yield apparently the conclusion that when the cheese is in front of our noses, we see signs of cheese. Okay. Evidence of cheese. The fact that the cheese is under our nose constitutes evidence of cheese. Okay, that's a crazy wrong way to talk. What we've done is we've yanked ordinary words out of their ordinary context, stipulated fully bizarre philosophical meanings for them, and then brought them back into the ordinary context and held that we've explained the phenomena. I'd love to give you some more quick examples. Yeah. One more. The plain man's, this is on 10. Moreover, though the plain man's alleged belief that his sense perceptions can in general or now be trusted is implicitly contrasted with the philosopher's view, it turns out that the philosopher's view is not just that his sense perceptions can't be trusted now or in general. And that would make sense. Like, okay, I realize that I'm having a psychotic episode. I just ingested LSD or whatever. All right. My sense perceptions can't be trusted now, I might think, or someone might think that of me. And that might be true. And that's a sensible thing to say. For apparently, philosophers, for the most part, really maintain, all this is semi-quotes from Ayer, that the plain man believes that what the plain man believes to be the case is never the case. What, in their opinion, we directly perceive is always an object of a different kind. There's a quote. The philosopher is not really going to argue that things go wrong more often than the unwary man supposes, but that in some sense or some way, he's wrong all the time about what he sees. We are all wrong, except the philosopher, of a certain kind, about what we see. The case is made much worse here by the unexplained introduction of a quite new creation, our sense perceptions in the Ayer passage. These entities, which of course don't figure at all in the plain man's language or among his beliefs, are brought in with the implication that whenever we perceive, there is an intermediate entity always present and informing us about something else. The question is, can we or can't we trust what it says? Is it veridical? But of course, to state the case in this way is simply to soften up the plain man's alleged views for the subsequent treatment. It is preparing the way for, by practically attributing to him, the plain man, the ordinary person, the so-called philosopher's view. It is important to remember that talk of deception only makes sense against a background of non-deception. You can't fool all the people all the time. It must be possible to recognize a case of deception by checking the odd case against more normal ones. So if you say we're all deceived all the time, you're not any longer talking about deception, or you're no longer in a world in which the concept of deception can even be articulated. All right, so in one class or in a lecture or another, we'll go on to the details of Austin's treatment of the argument from illusion. You get versions of it in Berkeley, for example, in Hume, in Descartes. The dream argument is a version of the argument from illusion. All right, and that's my man, John Langshaw Austin.